I spent $200,000 building a custom lake house for my grandparents' retirement celebration. But when I pulled into the driveway on Friday morning, I saw a stranger with a professional camera taking photos of the porch. My grandfather Elias was standing in the corner with his hands shaking uncontrollably. Something was deeply wrong. I pushed past the photographer and threw open the front door. My sister-in-law, Brittany, was shoving my grandfather's vintage jazz records and his daily blood pressure medication into a black plastic trash bag. She looked up at me, without an ounce of guilt, and smiled. "You are right on time, Alicia," she said. "The first Airbnb guests arrive at 4 this afternoon. Before I tell you how I systematically dismantled her life and took back my family property, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. If you have ever watched greedy relatives try to take advantage of the elderly, hit the like button and subscribe. You are going to love how this story ends." I dropped my keys on the kitchen counter. The heavy sound echoed through the open-concept living room that I had designed specifically for my grandparents' comfort. Brittany did not even flinch. She just kept tossing items into the garbage. I walked over and grabbed her wrist hard enough to make her drop a handful of orange prescription bottles onto the hardwood floor. I asked her what she thought she was doing. She yanked her arm away and rolled her eyes at me like I was a rebellious teenager instead of a 32-year-old wealth manager who had funded this entire project. Brittany smoothed down her expensive linen shirt and sighed dramatically. She told me to calm down and stop being so toxic. She said that she and my brother Terrence had decided the house was simply too big for two old people. According to her, they were doing the family a favor by creating a passive income stream. I stared at her in absolute disbelief. This woman who had married into our family exactly 1 year ago was standing in the house I paid for, throwing away my grandfather's heart medication to make room for vacationers. I demanded to know where my grandmother was. Before Brittany could answer, my brother Terrence strolled into the room, carrying a stack of fresh white hotel towels. Terrence had always been the golden child of our family. He could do no wrong in our parents' eyes, even when he dropped out of college and racked up massive debts. Now he stood there looking incredibly proud of himself. He smiled and said Grandma Ruby was in the backyard. He explained that they were moving our grandparents into the old boat shed near the water so the main house could be rented out for $1,200 a night. The boat shed was a drafty wooden shack with no insulation and a leaking roof. I felt a cold wave of pure rage wash over me. I told Terrence that he had lost his mind if he thought our grandparents were going to live in a shack while strangers slept in their custom orthopedic beds. I pulled out my phone and told them they had exactly 5 minutes to pack up their towels and get out of the house before I called the police for trespassing and elder abuse. Terrence did not panic. He did not apologize. Instead, he set the towels down on the kitchen island and reached into his back pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper and slapped it onto the granite countertop. He crossed his arms and smirked at me with a level of arrogance that made my blood boil. He told me I was not calling anyone. He said the house belonged to him now. I picked up the paper. It was a quitclaim deed. My eyes scanned the legal jargon until I reached the bottom of the page. Right there on the signature line was the frail, shaky handwriting of my grandfather Elias. It had been officially notarized just 3 days ago. My heart hammered against my ribs as I read the document again, making sure my eyes were not playing tricks on me. Terrence had somehow legally transferred the property into his own name. Brittany stepped forward and crossed her arms, mirroring her husband. She started using her usual therapy speak, trying to gaslight me into accepting the situation. She said they were building generational wealth for the family, and that I needed to respect Terrence's role as the man of the house. She claimed that keeping this luxury property just for two elderly people was a poor return on investment. She actually had the audacity to tell me that as a finance professional, I should understand the numbers better than anyone. I looked through the front window and saw Grandpa Elias still standing on the porch. The photographer was moving him out of the frame so he could get a clean shot of the custom mahogany front doors. My grandfather looked so confused and incredibly small. He had worked his entire life as a mechanic, ruining his back to provide for our family. He deserved to spend his final years sitting by the lake in comfort. Instead, his own grandson had tricked him into signing away his sanctuary for quick cash. I turned my attention back to Terrence and Brittany. I did not scream or throw a tantrum. In my line of work, I deal with ruthless corporate sharks every single day. I know that whoever loses their temper first loses the war. So I kept my voice dangerously soft and level. I asked Terrence how exactly he got our grandfather to sign that paper. Terrence laughed and said the old man signed it willingly because he wanted to help his favorite grandson launch a new tech startup. Brittany checked her sparkling gold watch and interrupted us. She said they did not have time to argue with me because the cleaning crew was running late and the guests were arriving soon for a bachelor party. She told me to go out back and help move the rest of my grandparents' belongings into the shed so they would not bother the paying customers. The sheer entitlement radiating from her was suffocating. She was treating my grandparents like stray dogs that needed to be locked away. I looked at the trash bag full of my grandfather's prized jazz records and his essential medications. Then I looked at the quitclaim deed sitting on the counter. A brilliant and devastating realization began to form in my mind. Terrence and Brittany thought they had outsmarted everyone. They thought they had secured a gold mine. They had no idea that they had just stepped into a massive legal and financial trap. But I was not going to reveal my cards just yet. I needed them to feel safe. I needed them to commit to the Airbnb rental so I could destroy them completely. I took a deep breath and forced the anger out of my voice. I asked Brittany how much she wanted for the weekend. Terrence raised an eyebrow and exchanged a confused look with his wife. Brittany smirked and pulled out her phone. She said if I wanted to stay and host the retirement party for the family tomorrow, I would have to rent the property like any other guest. She typed on her screen and told me the weekend rate, including the cleaning fee and security deposit, was $2,500. Just then the kitchen door swung open and my mother Valerie walked in. She was carrying a silver tray loaded with expensive smoked salmon canapés and imported cheeses instead of the traditional barbecue she usually made for family gatherings. She looked at the tension in the room and immediately sided with Terrence just like she had done my entire life. Valerie set the tray down and sighed, shaking her head at me. She told me to stop being so difficult and jealous of my brother's ambition. She said Terrence was simply trying to build something for his future, and that the boat shed was perfectly fine for my grandparents since it had a small fan. She actually stood there in the luxury kitchen I had paid for and told me I was being selfish for trying to ruin Terrence's new business venture. She reminded me that I already had a successful career and that it was my duty as a sister to step back and let my brother shine. I looked at the woman who raised me. She was so desperate to maintain the illusion of a perfect wealthy family that she was willing to throw her own parents into a damp shed just so her golden boy could play pretend entrepreneur. I did not argue with her. Arguing with Valerie was like talking to a brick wall. She had spent 32 years making excuses for Terrence and she was never going to stop. Instead, I walked past her and went straight to my grandfather. I gently took Elias by the arm and guided him away from Terrence. I told my grandparents that we were leaving. Grandma Ruby was already standing by the hallway, clutching her small overnight bag, looking terrified of the loud voices. I promised them they were not going to sleep in a shed. Terrence laughed from the kitchen and yelled out that I was overreacting. Brittany called out, reminding me that the guests were arriving in less than an hour and that she needed the $2,500 if I wanted access to the property tomorrow. I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app. I did exactly what she asked. I transferred $2,500 directly into Brittany's account. But in the memo line of the transfer, I very deliberately typed weekend rental lake house, establishing a legally binding paper trail. My phone buzzed a few seconds later with an automated confirmation email from the rental platform. I had officially become their tenant. They thought they were extorting me, but they had just handed me the exact legal leverage I needed to ruin them. I knew that tenant rights in our state were incredibly strict, and by accepting my money, Brittany had just given me full legal authority over the property for the next 48 hours. I walked my grandparents out to my car and helped them into the back seat. As I pulled out of the driveway, I saw 3 cars full of loud, obnoxious guys pulling in for the bachelor party. They were already carrying cases of cheap beer and shouting at each other. I felt a pang of guilt leaving the beautiful house to be trashed, but I knew it was a necessary sacrifice for the trap I was setting. I drove us straight to a luxury hotel downtown and booked their best suite. Once my grandparents were settled on the plush velvet sofas with hot tea and room service, I sat down next to Elias. I took his frail hands in mine and asked him to tell me exactly what happened with that quitclaim deed. Elias looked down at his lap, and tears began to well up in his clouded eyes. He told me that Terrence came to visit him last week while I was out of town for a financial conference. Terrence brought a stack of papers and told Elias they were state medical consent forms. Terrence claimed the forms would help pay for Grandma Ruby's new heart medication through a federal senior assistance program. My grandfather wiped a tear from his wrinkled cheek. He said his eyesight was getting so bad he could not read the small print at the bottom of the pages. He trusted his grandson. Terrence even brought a friend along who claimed to be a state worker, but was actually just a shady notary, public willing to stamp anything for a quick buck. Elias signed every single page, thinking he was securing medical care for his wife. He had no idea he was signing away the rights to the property. My blood ran cold. This was not just greedy family drama anymore. This was a calculated predatory crime. Terrence had committed elder abuse and fraud against the man who had bought him his first bicycle and paid for his college tuition. I hugged my grandfather and promised him everything was going to be all right. I told him Terrence was going to pay for what he did. I opened my laptop on the hotel desk and logged into the county public records database. Working in wealth management meant I had access to real estate tracking tools most people did not even know existed. I pulled up the deed Terrence had filed and started digging through the municipal filings. I needed to see exactly how he structured this theft so I could dismantle it piece by piece. What I found made me stop breathing for a second. Terrence had not just transferred the deed into his name. Less than 24 hours after tricking our grandfather, he had used that fraudulent deed as collateral to take out a $300,000 hard money loan. He borrowed the money from a notorious predatory lending group in the city that charged 18% interest. Suddenly, everything made sense. Terrence did not have a tech startup. He had massive underground gambling debts that the family had been whispering about for months. He used our grandfather's home to save his own life from loan sharks and used the leftover cash to buy Brittany that ridiculous new luxury car sitting in the driveway. He had literally gambled away our grandparents' retirement. My phone started vibrating on the desk. It was my mother Valerie calling, probably to yell at me for causing a scene and embarrassing her in front of her daughter-in-law. I stared at the screen, letting it ring, while a cold, calculating calm washed over me. Terrence and Brittany had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. They were about to learn why you never try to outsmart someone who manages millions of dollars for a living. I picked up my phone and prepared to set the first trap. The phone was still vibrating against the polished wood of the hotel desk. I looked at the screen and saw my mother's name flashing. Valerie. She was calling to demand that I fix the mess I had supposedly created by taking my grandparents away. I took a deep breath, letting the cold, calculating energy settle into my bones. I answered the call and put it on speaker so my grandparents would not hear the venom in her voice from the other room. Valerie did not even say hello. She launched straight into a tirade about how embarrassed she was. She said I had ruined what was supposed to be a productive weekend for Terrence. She told me that the bachelor party guests were already complaining about the lack of extra trash bags and that Terrence and Brittany were too busy managing the property listing to clean up after them. She demanded that I drive back immediately and handle the cleaning. She actually said it was the least I could do since I was being so unsupportive of my brother's new tech startup. I let her talk. I let her spin her web of delusions. She was so deep in her enabling that she could not see the reality of what Terrence had done. I asked her calmly if she knew how Terrence had acquired the deed. Valerie scoffed and said our grandfather gave it to him willingly because he believed in Terrence's vision. She said I was just bitter because Terrence was finally stepping up as the man of the family and taking charge of our financial legacy. I asked her if she knew about the $300,000 loan. The line went silent for a fraction of a second. But then Valerie quickly recovered. She said all successful businesses require startup capital, and that leveraging assets is just a smart financial strategy. She was repeating Brittany's therapy speak word for word. She told me that if I truly cared about Black generational wealth, I would stop acting like a jealous child and start supporting my brother. I realized then that my mother was fully complicit. She might not have known about the fraud initially, but she was willing to defend it now to protect her golden child. I did not raise my voice. I told her I would be there first thing in the morning. I said I would come back to the lake house and make sure everything was handled properly for the retirement party. Valerie sounded relieved and told me to bring some nice champagne for Terrence to celebrate his first successful booking. I hung up the phone and opened my contact list. Now it was time to make the real calls. As a wealth manager, I spent years building relationships with the most ruthless legal and municipal professionals in the state. I started by calling the non-emergency line for the local police department. I requested a civil standby for the next morning, explaining that I was a legal tenant entering a potentially volatile property dispute. The dispatcher took my information and promised to send 2 units. Then I called the president of the Lake Norman Homeowners Association. His name was Richard, and he was notoriously strict about the community guidelines. I told Richard that an illegal short-term rental was operating on the protected wetlands of our subdivision. I mentioned that a bachelor party was currently trashing the property and likely violating the strict noise and waste ordinances. Richard was furious and promised to be there at sunrise with his citation book. My final call was to the County Water Resource Commission. The lake house was built right on the edge of a protected environmental zone. Operating a commercial business there without proper permits carried massive federal fines. I left a detailed voicemail for the lead inspector outlining the exact violations Terrence and Brittany were committing. After the calls were done, I walked over to the business center in the hotel lobby. I spent the next 2 hours printing out every piece of evidence. I printed the fraudulent quitclaim deed, the public record of the hard money loan, the environmental hazard maps, and my legally binding Airbnb receipt. I organized them meticulously into a thick black binder. This was not just a folder of papers, it was a loaded weapon. I went back up to the suite to check on my grandparents. Grandma Ruby was asleep in the oversized king bed, finally looking peaceful. Grandpa Elias was sitting by the window looking out at the city lights. I sat down next to him and handed him a cup of warm tea. He asked me if we were going to lose the lake house. I looked him in the eye and promised him that nobody was taking our family sanctuary. I told him Terrence had made a fatal miscalculation. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the dark going over every legal loophole and every financial consequence. Terrence thought he could steal from the people who loved him most and use our mother as a shield. Brittany thought she could use modern buzzwords to justify her blatant greed. They had no idea that the house they were so proudly renting out was just a tiny piece of a much larger puzzle. The sun began to rise over the city skyline. I took a quick shower and put on my sharpest business suit. Today, I was not just a sister or a daughter. I was a corporate executioner. I gathered my black binder and woke my grandparents. It was time to go back to the lake house. We drove back up the winding driveway just as the morning fog was lifting off the water. The scene was exactly as chaotic as I had anticipated. The beautifully landscaped yard was littered with crushed beer cans and broken lawn chairs. The bachelor party guests were nowhere to be seen, probably passed out inside. But Terrence and Brittany were out on the porch frantically scrubbing spilled alcohol off the custom wood decking. They looked exhausted and miserable. My mother was standing near the front door, holding a trash bag and complaining about the smell. When they saw my car pull up, Terrence dropped his scrub brush and stood up straight, trying to look authoritative. He marched over to my car window with a smug expression on his face, completely unaware of the police cruisers that were about to turn onto our street. Terrence tapped on my window with a huge, arrogant grin. I rolled it down slowly and looked at him. He leaned in and told me I was late and that he expected me to bring the cleaning supplies he asked for. He said the bachelor party had left a huge mess inside and that I needed to hurry up and get the grandparents settled in the shed before the next group arrived. I did not say a word. I just looked past his shoulder at the end of the driveway. Terrence frowned and turned around just as two black and white police cruisers pulled onto the property. Their gravel crunching under the heavy tires made Brittany freeze on the porch. The scrub brush slipped out of her hand. My mother Valerie came running out of the front door looking completely terrified. She grabbed Terrence's arm and asked him what was going on. Terrence tried to look calm, but his voice was shaking. He told my mother that it was probably just a noise complaint from the neighbors about the party last night. He smoothed down his shirt and walked toward the officers, putting on his best fake professional smile. He introduced himself as the property owner and started apologizing for the noise. I opened my car door and stepped out. I walked right past my brother and handed my driver's license to the first officer. I told the officer that I was the one who requested the civil standby. Terrence looked at me like I had lost my mind. He laughed nervously and told the officers that I was just his jealous sister trying to cause trouble for his new business. The officer ignored him and looked at my ID. I opened my black binder and pulled out the printed receipt from the rental platform. I handed it to the officer and explained that I had legally rented this entire property for the weekend. I told him I had paid $2,500 for exclusive access and that these three people were trespassing on my rented time. Brittany ran down the porch steps, her face turning bright red. She started yelling that I was crazy and that she was the host who approved the booking. The officer held up his hand and told her to step back. He reviewed the receipt and the platform terms of service I had highlighted. He looked at Terrence and Brittany and calmly explained that according to state tenant laws, a paid short-term rental agreement grants the guest exclusive use of the property. He told them they had no legal right to be on the premises without my permission. Terrence lost his temper. He started waving his arms and screaming that he owned the house. He said he had the deed to prove it and that nobody could kick him off his own land. He demanded that the officers arrest me for filing a false police report. My mother started crying and begging me to stop this nonsense. She told the officers this was all a big misunderstanding and that we were family. I stood there perfectly calm. I looked Terrence dead in the eye and asked him if he really thought he owned the land. Terrence puffed out his chest and said he had the notarized quitclaim deed signed by our grandfather. I pulled out another document from my binder and handed it to him. I told him to read the name of the property owner on the actual county tax records. Terrence snatched the paper from my hand. His eyes darted back and forth across the page. The color completely drained from his face. I explained loudly enough for the police and my mother to hear. I told them that our grandfather Elias never owned the land the lake house sits on. I bought this land through a blind trust 2 years ago to protect my privacy and ensure my grandparents would always have a safe place to live. Terrence's hands started to shake, just like my grandfather's had the day before. He stammered and asked what exactly he had forced our grandfather to sign if it was not this property. Brittany grabbed the paper from Terrence's hands and stared at it. She looked at me with pure panic in her eyes. She started using her therapy speak again, but her voice was trembling. She said I was manipulating the situation, and that the physical house still belonged to whoever held the deed. She claimed that since Terrence had the deed to the house, I had no right to kick them out. I could not help but smile. It was the moment I had been waiting for. I pulled out the original purchase agreement for the lake house and held it up. I told Brittany that this beautiful $200,000 structure was a high-end modular home. I explained that under state law, it was legally classified as chattel, which meant it was personal property, just like a car or a recreational vehicle. It was fully registered in my name and completely separate from the land. Terrence owned absolutely nothing here. He had no rights to the house and no rights to the land. Terrence stumbled backward like he had been physically punched. He looked at the massive custom home and then looked at the worthless quitclaim deed in his hand. He asked me in a desperate whisper what land he actually owned. I pulled out the exact deed he had fraudulently filed and handed it to the police officer. I told Terrence that our grandfather owned exactly one piece of property in his entire life. It was an abandoned, rundown gas station from the 1970s located 2 towns over. I watched the realization hit him. I told him that the old gas station had a massive environmental protection agency lien on it because of leaking underground chemical tanks. Terrence had just tricked his own grandfather into giving him a toxic waste dump that came with a $500,000 federal cleanup fine. My mother gasped and covered her mouth. Brittany started hyperventilating. She grabbed Terrence's shirt and screamed, asking him what he had done. I was not finished. I took a step closer to my brother and lowered my voice. I reminded him about the $300,000 hard money loan he took out against the fraudulent deed. I told him that since he used a fake deed for a toxic property to secure that loan, he had officially committed first-degree mortgage fraud and wire fraud. I looked at Brittany and told her the men who lent them that money were not a friendly neighborhood bank. I said they were ruthless loan sharks who were going to come looking for their money long before the Federal Bureau of Investigation ever got involved. Terrence stood there paralyzed. He could not even form a coherent sentence. The arrogance that had fueled him his entire life evaporated in an instant. Just as the police officer was handing my receipt back to me, another car pulled into the driveway. It was a white county vehicle followed closely by a silver sedan. Richard, the president of the Homeowners Association, stepped out of the sedan holding a clipboard. The county water resource inspector stepped out of the white vehicle wearing a high-visibility vest. Richard marched straight up to the porch, completely ignoring my mother, who was now sobbing into her hands. He looked at Terrence and Brittany and asked if they were the ones operating the illegal commercial rental business. Brittany tried to step backwards, but she tripped over the scrub brush she had dropped earlier. Richard did not wait for an answer. He started reading off the list of violations. He cited them for unauthorized commercial activity noise ordinance violations and improper waste disposal. Then the county inspector stepped forward. He looked at the messy yard and the proximity to the lake water. He handed Terrence a thick yellow citation. He explained that operating a high-capacity rental property without upgrading the septic permits on protected wetlands carried a $10,000 immediate fine. He told Terrence he had 30 days to pay it, or a lien would be placed on whatever assets he currently owned. Brittany completely lost her mind. She looked at the citations, and then looked at the massive federal cleanup fine I had just exposed. She realized her perfect, wealthy lifestyle was a complete illusion. She screamed at Terrence that he was a failure. She reached into her purse and pulled out the keys to the brand-new Tesla he had bought her with the loan money. She threw them at his chest, but they missed and clattered onto the wooden porch. She yelled that she was filing for divorce immediately and running far away from this nightmare. My mother, Valerie, fell to her knees on the driveway. She crawled toward me and grabbed the hem of my pants. She begged me to call my lawyers and fix everything. She said Terrence was my brother and that I had enough money to pay off the loan sharks and the fines. She pleaded with me to save our family reputation. I looked down at the woman who had spent 32 years treating me like a burden. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity and no guilt. I stepped back, forcing her to let go of my clothes. I told her she had chosen her son over her own parents' safety and well-being. I said they both deserved exactly what was coming to them. I turned to the police officers and asked them to please escort the trespassers off my property. As I watched the officers step forward to guide my brother and his wife toward the street, my mind drifted back to the quiet solitude of the hotel suite the night before. I needed to reflect on the exact moment I secured my victory. After my grandfather Elias had broken down crying and confessed how Terrence tricked him into signing the fraudulent deed, I had walked into the adjoining room of our suite. I sat alone in the dark, staring at the glowing screen of my phone. Brittany had sent me a smug text message with a formal invoice attached. She demanded $2,500 if I wanted to use the lake house for the retirement party. She even included a passive-aggressive little note telling me to consider it an investment in my brother's future. My initial instinct had been pure rage. I wanted to call my lawyers immediately and file an emergency injunction, I wanted to drive back to the lake house and scream at them for their sheer audacity. I wanted to tear down the doors of the house I built and drag them out into the street. But my career as a wealth manager had taught me that emotion is the ultimate enemy of strategy. In high-stakes corporate acquisitions, the most dangerous move you can make is showing your hand too early. If I fought them on the invoice, they might have panicked and tried to cover their tracks. They might have called their shady notary friend to fabricate more documents. Or worse, they might have found a way to lock me out of the property completely before the party, leaving my grandparents devastated. I needed them to feel entirely in control. I needed them to believe that their extortion had worked perfectly. So I opened my banking application. I stared at the screen for a long time, watching the cursor blink in the amount field. I typed in $2,500. It was a small price to pay for the total destruction of my enemies, but the money itself was not the weapon. The weapon was the paper trail. In our state, the laws regarding short-term rentals and tenant rights are incredibly rigid and highly protective of the renter. By paying that specific invoice, I was not just giving them cash. I was establishing a legally binding landlord and tenant contract. I was purchasing the authority of the state to back up my claim to the property. I moved down to the memo line on the transfer screen. This was the most critical part of the plan. If I left it blank, Brittany could later claim the money was a gift or a family contribution. She could say I was just helping out with Terrence's startup costs. I carefully typed out the words "weekend rental lake house." Those 4 words legally designated the payment as a commercial real estate transaction. It meant that for the next 48 hours, I was the sole legal occupant of that property. It meant that Terrence and Brittany, despite holding a fraudulent deed, were suddenly bound by the strict laws of hospitality compliance. They had effectively handed over the keys to the kingdom for a fraction of what it was worth. I pressed confirm and watched the loading circle spin on my screen. The money left my account instantly. I set my phone down on the glass table and waited. The silence in the hotel room was heavy. I could hear the faint sound of city traffic 20 stories below. I knew that Brittany was probably sitting in the beautiful kitchen I had designed, laughing at how easily she had forced me to submit. She probably thought my payment was a sign of weakness. She probably bragged to Terrence that she had finally put the arrogant sister in her place. She had no idea that she was dealing with someone who engineered hostile takeovers for breakfast. 10 minutes passed, then 15. I kept my eyes locked on the dark screen of my phone. Finally, it vibrated against the glass. I picked it up and saw exactly what I had been waiting for. It was an automated email confirmation from the Airbnb platform, forwarded directly from Brittany's host account. It confirmed my payment and officially welcomed me as the guest for the weekend. The email included the check-in time, the property rules, and a binding digital receipt with a unique confirmation number. I smiled in the dark hotel room. The trap was officially set and locked into place. By accepting my money through a formal platform, Brittany had unknowingly activated a massive chain of legal liabilities. She had guaranteed me exclusive access to the premises, which meant I could legally have anyone removed for trespassing, including the supposed owners. More importantly, it established a documented timeline of their commercial operation on protected wetlands. This digital receipt was the exact evidence I needed for the Water Resource Commission and the Homeowners Association. It proved they were conducting illegal business on residential conservation land. They had woven their own noose and handed me the rope. I remember looking back into the bedroom where my grandparents were finally sleeping peacefully under the heavy hotel blankets. I whispered a quiet promise to them. I promised that by tomorrow afternoon, the people who had hurt them would have absolutely nothing left. It was that moment of strategic submission that made everything else possible. It was the $2,500 that bought me the right to stand on my driveway this morning and watch the police do their job. I blinked, and the memory of the hotel room faded away. I was back in the present moment, standing in the crisp morning air at the lake house. The police officers were firmly instructing Terrence and Brittany to start walking down the driveway. Terrence was still in a state of shock, looking back at me with wide, terrified eyes. Brittany was sobbing hysterically, clutching her designer purse as her perfect life crumbled around her. My mother Valerie was still on the ground weeping and begging for forgiveness, but her voice was completely ignored. The strategy had worked flawlessly. The legally binding contract I had created the night before was the ultimate weapon, and it had delivered a devastating blow. After receiving the Airbnb confirmation, I knew I had secured the perimeter. But I needed to know exactly how deep Terrence had dug his own grave. I walked over to the desk in the hotel suite and opened my laptop. The blue light illuminated the dark room. My grandparents were fast asleep in the bedroom behind me. I pulled out my cell phone and looked at the time. It was past midnight, but in the world of high finance, the clock does not matter. I scrolled through my contacts and pressed the call button for my personal real estate attorney. His name was Jonathan, and I paid his firm a massive monthly retainer for exactly this type of emergency. Jonathan answered on the second ring, sounding wide awake. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him my brother had somehow managed to get our grandfather to sign a quitclaim deed, transferring property ownership. Jonathan asked me for the parcel number and told me to log into the county public records database while he pulled up the state registry on his end. Working as a wealth manager gave me access to premium software that aggregates municipal filings, tax assessments, and title histories in real time. I typed my secure credentials into the portal and watched the dashboard load. I entered the last name and the county parameters. Within seconds, the system generated a list of recent filings. Right at the top was the quitclaim deed. I downloaded the high-resolution scan and opened it on my screen. I told Jonathan I was looking at the document. The signature at the bottom was definitely my grandfather's shaky cursive. But the notary stamp next to it caught my immediate attention. I zoomed in on the black ink seal. The name on the notary stamp was Julian Carter. I felt a sharp laugh escape my throat. I told Jonathan the name. Julian Carter was a guy my brother went to high school with. He was famous in our neighborhood for running small-time hustles and getting fired from every legitimate job he ever had. Terrence had not used a reputable legal professional. He had used his shady friend, who probably bought a notary stamp online, and cared more about a quick $100 than verifying the legality of a property transfer. Jonathan pulled up Julian's license number in the state registry. He told me that Julian had a history of administrative warnings and that his commission was barely active. I explained to Jonathan that Julian clearly had not run a basic title search. If he had, he would have seen that my grandfather never owned the land the lake house sat on. Julian just blindly stamped a piece of paper for his buddy without doing any due diligence. He had officially implicated himself in federal elder abuse and real estate fraud. I asked Jonathan what our next move should be. He told me we could file an emergency motion to invalidate the deed based on fraud and lack of mental capacity. But I stopped him. I told Jonathan I did not just want to invalidate the deed. I wanted to completely destroy the financial foundation of everyone involved. I wanted to see exactly what Terrence planned to do with a piece of paper he thought made him a millionaire. I went back to the search bar in the county database. I typed in Terrence's full name and hit enter. The system took a few seconds to query the servers. When the results populated, my eyes widened. There was the initial quitclaim deed filed earlier in the week, but right beneath it was a brand new filing. It had an orange tag next to it, indicating it had been processed just 24 hours ago. I clicked on the orange tag, and a new document loaded onto my screen. It was a deed of trust. I felt my heart drop into my stomach. I read the legal jargon line by line. Terrence had not just stolen the property to run a cheap short-term rental business with his wife. The Airbnb was just a front to cover his tracks and generate pocket change. Terrence had used the fraudulent quitclaim deed as collateral to take out a massive loan. I read the name of the lending institution listed on the filing. It was not a traditional commercial bank or a reputable credit union. It was an entity called Apex Capital Solutions. I knew that name from my corporate dealings. They were a notorious hard money lender operating out of a strip mall 2 counties over. Hard money lenders do not care about credit scores or business plans. They only care about collateral, and they charge predatory interest rates. They are the legal equivalent of loan sharks for desperate people who cannot get money anywhere else. I told Jonathan to look at the secondary filing. I heard him swear under his breath over the phone. He told me that Terrence had leveraged the property for $300,000. The terms of the loan were absolutely brutal. 18% interest with a balloon payment due in exactly 12 months. I stared at the screen feeling a mix of horror and absolute vindication. My brother was always trying to portray himself as a smart, sophisticated entrepreneur. He walked around our parents' house bragging about tech startups and venture capital. But the public records laid bare the pathetic reality of his life. Nobody takes out a $300,000 hard money loan at 18% interest to fund a legitimate business. You take out that kind of money when you are completely desperate and someone is threatening to break your legs. I thought about the rumors I had heard from my cousins over the past few years. Whispers about Terrence spending weekends at underground poker games and losing thousands of dollars betting on offshore sports websites. Our mother Valerie always rushed to silence those rumors, claiming Terrence was just networking with high net worth individuals. But the numbers on my screen did not lie. Terrence was drowning in debt. He had tricked our grandfather into signing away his retirement home so he could bail himself out of a massive hole. And the leftover cash was exactly what he used to buy Brittany that shiny new electric vehicle sitting in the driveway. They were parading around pretending to be a power couple while funding their lifestyle with stolen money and criminal loans. I asked Jonathan about the legal implications of the loan. Jonathan explained that because Terrence used a fraudulent document to secure funding across state banking lines, he had escalated his crimes from local elder abuse to federal mortgage fraud and wire fraud. The moment he signed that loan agreement, he crossed into territory that carried mandatory federal prison sentences. I thanked Jonathan for his time and told him to draft the necessary affidavits for the morning. We ended the call and the hotel room fell silent again. I looked back at the screen at the active lien glowing in the dark. Terrence thought he had secured his future. He had no idea he had just signed his own death warrant. The investigation was yielding more ammunition than I could have ever imagined. Terrence did not just steal the house. He immediately leveraged it and locked himself into a federal crime. The trap was fully loaded. I sat back in the hotel desk chair and stared at the glowing screen. The trap was fully loaded, but my mind could not let go of the numbers. As a wealth manager, I do not just look at the surface of a loan. I track the flow of capital. $300,000 is a massive amount of cash to liquidate in less than a week. I needed to know exactly where every single penny went. I opened a new secure tab and accessed the state collateral registry. Hard money lenders always file universal commercial code documents to secure their assets. I pulled up the disbursements tied to Apex Capital Solutions. The money had been wired into a brand new checking account under Terrence's name exactly 4 days ago. From there, it was immediately fractured into a dozen different transactions. I decided to follow the most obvious purchase first. I ran a search on the electric vehicle registration database for our county. Sure enough, the brand new luxury car sitting in the driveway of the lake house was registered to Brittany just 2 days ago. But she did not lease it and she did not finance it through a dealership. The public records showed it was purchased outright for $85,000 with a direct wire transfer. Brittany loved to preach about passive income and building generational wealth, but her entire luxury persona was a complete fabrication. She was driving around in a status symbol funded entirely by a criminal loan taken out against an elderly man's stolen property. She was an accomplice to elder abuse, and she was too busy posting on social media to even realize the massive danger she was in. That still left over $200,000 unaccounted for. I knew Terrence did not have a legitimate tech startup. There were no business licenses registered in his name. There were no corporate tax identifiers tied to his social security number. But I had my professional ways of finding hidden debts. I logged into a specialized credit tracking terminal that monitors high-risk financial behavior across international lines. Terrence had 3 different domestic checking accounts flagged for severe overdrafts over the last 6 months. But what caught my eye was a series of massive structured wire transfers sent to an offshore holding company based in the Cayman Islands. In my line of work, I see these types of offshore accounts all the time. They are classic shell corporations used to launder money for underground gambling rings and offshore sports betting syndicates. Terrence had executed 5 separate wire transfers in the span of 48 hours. Each transfer was carefully kept under the $10,000 federal reporting limit to avoid triggering an automatic Internal Revenue Service audit. It was a technique called smurfing, and it was another federal crime to add to his growing list of offenses. My brother had not just made a few bad bets with his friends. He was buried alive in the criminal underworld. He had probably been receiving threatening phone calls for months. The golden child of our family, who always had to wear the best designer clothes and drive the fastest cars, had literally gambled his life away. When the loan sharks finally backed him into a corner, he did not confess his failures to our parents. He did not ask for help. Instead, he drove to our grandfather's house with a fake state worker and a stack of papers to steal the only valuable asset the old man had left. He traded his own grandfather's safety to save his own skin. I thought about how many times our mother Valerie had scolded me for working too hard. She always told me I should be more like Terrence. She said he understood how to take big risks and live a large lifestyle while I was too cautious and boring. Now her risk-taking son was a federal criminal staring down a decade in prison, and my boring caution was the only thing standing between our grandparents and absolute financial ruin. I closed the terminal window and downloaded the complete wire transfer logs. I added them to the digital folder I was building. This was the exact proof the federal investigators would need to lock him away. Just as I was saving the final document, the heavy silence of the hotel room was broken. My cell phone started vibrating loudly against the wooden desk. The bright screen illuminated the dark room with an incoming call. The caller ID flashed my mother's name, Valerie. I looked at the digital clock on the bedside table. It was nearly 2 in the morning. My mother never called this late unless she needed to complain about something or demand a massive favor. I picked up the phone and accepted the call without saying a word. Valerie did not wait for a greeting. Her voice came through the speaker sharp and full of absolute toxic rage. She demanded to know what I thought I was doing. She said I had humiliated the entire family by sneaking our grandparents out like thieves in the night. She told me Terrence was incredibly stressed because the bachelor party guests were being rowdy and demanding extra amenities, and I was not there to help manage the situation. She actually had the nerve to tell me that I was ruining my brother's big entrepreneurial debut. She said Terrence needed this weekend to be absolutely perfect so he could get a 5-star rating on the rental platform. She yelled that I was being a spiteful and jealous sister. She said if I really cared about the family legacy, I would drive back to the lake house immediately and start cleaning up the empty beer bottles the guests had thrown into the yard. She wanted me, a 32-year-old successful wealth manager, to act as an unpaid maid for her criminal son. I listened to her scream into the phone. I did not interrupt her, I just let her toxic enabling wash over me. She was so completely blind to who her son really was. She was so desperate to maintain the illusion of his success that she was willing to sacrifice my dignity to protect him. I kept my voice perfectly flat and devoid of any emotion. I told her I would not be coming back tonight. I said the guests were Terrence's responsibility now, and he would have to handle the mess himself. Valerie gasped dramatically over the phone, calling me a massive disappointment. She said she expected to see me there at sunrise with a mop and a good attitude, or I was no longer welcome in her family. I told her very calmly that I would be there at sunrise. I hung up the phone and stared at the thick black binder of evidence sitting on the desk. She wanted me there at sunrise. She was going to get exactly what she asked for, but it was going to be the absolute worst morning of her entire life. I sat in the quiet hotel room, listening to the steady hum of the air conditioning. My mother's words echoed in the empty space around me. She wanted me to clean up after my brother. She wanted me to fix his mistakes, just like she had expected me to do my entire life. I looked at the black binder on the desk. This was not just a collection of legal documents anymore. It was the physical manifestation of 32 years of emotional neglect. Growing up, Valerie always made it clear that Terrence was the absolute priority. If Terrence needed a new laptop for school, I was told to use the public library computers. If Terrence wrecked his car, I was told to pick up extra shifts at my part-time job to help pay his insurance deductible. Valerie called it family loyalty, but it was always a one-way street. She conditioned me to believe that my only value in the family was my ability to absorb Terrence's failures and smooth out his path. But this time was completely different. Terrence had not just dented a bumper or failed a college course. He had committed severe federal crimes and endangered the lives of the two people who actually loved me unconditionally. My grandfather Elias and my grandmother Ruby were sleeping soundly in the next room, completely unaware of the massive storm I was about to unleash. I walked over to the door and checked on them one more time. Seeing their frail forms resting peacefully solidified my absolute resolve. Valerie had chosen her side. She had allied herself with a criminal, and she was going to face the harsh consequences of that choice. I spent the next few hours reviewing the state property codes and the federal environmental regulations. I needed to memorize every single statute and penalty code. When you are executing a hostile corporate takeover, you cannot rely on messy notes. You have to look your opponent dead in the eye and recite their destruction from memory. I went over the Apex Capital Solutions loan documents one more time. The 18% interest rate was a literal ticking time bomb. The loan sharks had structured the financial agreement so that any municipal violation would trigger an immediate acceleration clause. This meant that the moment the County Water Resource Commission issued their citation for the illegal Airbnb, the entire $300,000 principal would become due within 48 hours. Terrence was not just going to get a slap on the wrist. He was going to trigger a catastrophic financial collapse that would ruin his life forever. And Brittany was strapped right into the passenger seat of that sinking ship with her brand new electric vehicle. I thought about Brittany's arrogant face when she threw my grandfather's medication into the trash bag. I thought about her telling me I was toxic and unsupportive of Black generational wealth. She had weaponized therapy language to justify her own extreme greed and manipulation. Tomorrow she would learn the true, devastating meaning of consequences. As the sky outside the hotel window began to turn a pale shade of gray, I finally closed my laptop. I took a hot shower and put on a tailored navy blue suit. It was the exact same suit I wore when I negotiated a $50 million corporate merger last year. It was my financial armor. I tied my hair back into a tight bun and put on a pair of pearl earrings that my grandmother Ruby had given me for my college graduation. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. The frightened little girl who used to crave her mother's approval was completely gone. In her place was a cold, calculating woman who controlled her own destiny and protected her own blood. I woke my grandparents up gently. I ordered them a lavish room service breakfast with fresh fruit and warm pastries. I told them to eat and relax while I went to handle some important business at the lake house. Grandma Ruby held my hand and told me to be careful. She said Terrence had a terrible temper when things did not go his way. I smiled and kissed her warm forehead. I told her Terrence was about to find out that my temper was much, much worse. I left the hotel suite and walked down to the concrete parking garage. The morning air was crisp and cool against my face. I got into my car and placed the heavy black binder on the leather passenger seat. The drive to the lake house would take exactly 45 minutes. That gave me plenty of time to mentally rehearse the precise sequence of events. I had already set the legal trap with the $2,500 payment. I had already secured the civil standby from the local police department. I had already notified the strict homeowners association and the county environmental inspectors. All the moving pieces were falling into position exactly as I had orchestrated. My phone buzzed loudly in the center cup holder. It was a text message from Valerie. It said I better be on my way and that the bachelor party guys were starting to wake up and demand breakfast. She added that Terrence was very stressed and needed my help right now to manage the guests. I read the message and felt a cold, genuine smile form on my lips. She was still trying to command me like a servant. She was still trying to play the powerful matriarch of a family dynasty that was actually built on lies and stolen property. I merged my car onto the interstate highway and pressed the accelerator down. The sun was just starting to peek over the horizon, casting long, bright shadows across the empty roads. I thought about the very first time I showed my grandparents the finished lake house. I remembered the tears of pure joy in my grandfather's eyes when he saw the custom woodworking on the front porch. I remembered the excitement in my grandmother's voice when she saw the massive kitchen where she could bake for the holidays. Terrence and Valerie had tried to take all of that away from them. They had tried to trade a lifetime of love and hard work for a quick payout and a shiny new luxury car. They severely underestimated me. They thought because I was quiet and compliant as a young child, that I would remain a quiet pushover as an adult. They failed to realize that my silence was never a sign of weakness. It was constant observation. I had spent my entire life watching exactly how they operated. I knew their deepest vulnerabilities. I knew their darkest financial secrets. And today I was going to use every single one of those secrets to break them. I took the final exit off the highway and turned onto the winding forested road that led directly to the lake. The final act of their destruction was about to begin. I pulled my car into the empty parking lot of a 24-hour commercial printing center just 2 miles outside the Lake Norman subdivision gates. I kept the engine idling and connected my phone to the Bluetooth system. I had the legal strategy mapped out in my head, but I needed the local authorities to execute it perfectly. I was not going to walk into a house full of drunk bachelor party guests and a hostile brother without the full force of the law standing right behind me. Before I could face Terrence and Brittany, I needed to assemble the artillery. I picked up my phone and dialed the local county sheriff's non-emergency dispatch number. A tired-sounding operator answered the line. I kept my voice professional and calm. I gave her my name and explained that I was the legal renter of a residential property and that the previous occupants were refusing to leave the premises. I deliberately did not mention that they were my family members. In the eyes of the law, they were just trespassers violating a binding short-term lease agreement. I recited the address and requested a civil standby to prevent any potential violence during the eviction process. The operator typed on her keyboard and asked if there were any weapons on the property. I told her there were no weapons, but that the individuals were highly volatile. She confirmed that 2 patrol units would meet me at the end of the driveway at exactly 7 in the morning. The police were only the first layer of the trap. I disconnected the call and searched my contact list for Richard. Richard was the president of the Lake Norman Homeowners Association, and he was legendary in our area for his absolute ruthlessness. He was a retired military officer who handed out fines for grass being half an inch too tall or garbage cans being left out an hour too late. I called his direct cell phone number, knowing he was an early riser who patrolled the neighborhood every morning. He answered on the 3rd ring. I introduced myself as the property manager for my grandfather's estate. I told Richard that a rogue family member was currently operating an illegal Airbnb at our address and hosting a massive bachelor party. I could hear Richard gasp in pure outrage over the phone. I reminded him that Section 4 of the subdivision bylaws strictly prohibited commercial subletting and short-term rentals to preserve the quiet nature of the neighborhood. I told him there were currently 6 unauthorized vehicles parked on the grass, which violated the landscaping ordinances. Richard was absolutely furious. He thanked me for the tip and swore he would be there within the hour, with his citation book ready to issue the maximum daily fines. He promised to bring the neighborhood security vehicle to block them from leaving. But homeowners association fines were just a minor inconvenience compared to federal environmental penalties. The 3rd call was the most devastating component of my plan. The lake house sat on a highly regulated stretch of protected shoreline. When I built the custom home, I had to install a specialized low-capacity septic system strictly designed for two elderly residents. I dialed the emergency hotline for the County Water Resource Commission. The automated system beeped, and I left a highly detailed and urgent voicemail for the district inspector. I explained that an unpermitted commercial hotel operation was currently running on protected wetlands. I stated that over a dozen adult men were currently overloading a fragile residential septic system right next to the municipal drinking water supply. I quoted the exact municipal code they were violating. That specific violation carried an immediate $10,000 fine and the potential for federal criminal charges under the Clean Water Act. Terrence and Brittany were sleeping peacefully, completely unaware that they were currently committing an environmental crime that could ruin them financially forever. I ended the final call and stepped out of my car. The cool morning air felt sharp against my face. I walked into the brightly lit printing center and approached the self-service computer kiosks. I logged into my encrypted corporate cloud storage account. I needed everything printed in physical paper so they could not claim my digital screens were faked or altered. I hit print on the fraudulent quitclaim deed that Terrence had forced our grandfather to sign. I printed the public records of the $300,000 hard money loan from Apex Capital Solutions showing the predatory 18% interest rate. Then I printed the offshore wire transfer logs I had uncovered. These papers documented every single illegal gambling payment Terrence had made to the Cayman Islands. I printed the official zoning maps, highlighting the environmental protection boundaries around our property. Finally, I printed the digital receipt from the Airbnb platform. This was the golden ticket proving my $2,500 payment to Brittany, which gave me total legal authority over the house for the entire weekend. I walked over to the binding station and gathered the thick stack of warm papers from the printer tray. I purchased a heavy black leather binder and a set of plastic dividers. I meticulously organized the evidence. The deed went into the first section. The loan documents and gambling transfers went into the second. The environmental maps went into the third. The lease agreement went right at the front. I slid the papers carefully into the binder and snapped the heavy metal rings shut with a loud, sharp click. The binder felt incredibly heavy in my hands. It was the weight of justice and the physical end of my brother's entire fake empire. I paid the cashier and walked back out to the parking lot. I tossed the binder onto the leather passenger seat of my car and put the engine into drive. I drove the final 2 miles toward the massive wrought iron gates of the Lake Norman subdivision. I watched the sun begin to rise over the shimmering water, reflecting off my windshield. My family had declared war on me for 32 years, and they thought I would just surrender. They were about to learn that I had finally brought the artillery. I drove back to the luxury hotel in the heart of the city to pick up my grandparents. When I opened the door to the suite, they were both completely dressed and ready for the day. Grandma Ruby was wearing a beautiful floral print dress that she had bought specifically for the retirement celebration. Grandpa Elias had on his best tailored suit, looking proud and distinguished. They looked like royalty, and they deserved to be treated exactly that way. I helped them down the long carpeted hallway to the elevator and walked them out to the parking garage. I opened the heavy car doors for them and made sure they were comfortable before getting into the driver's seat. During the drive to the lake house, the car was incredibly quiet. I played some soft jazz music over the speakers to keep my grandfather calm and relaxed. He kept looking out the window with a sad expression on his face, probably thinking about the house he thought he had lost forever to his own grandson's greed. I reached over the center console and gently squeezed his hand. I reminded him that everything was completely under control and that today was going to be a beautiful day of celebration no matter what happened. I promised him that nobody was going to take his sanctuary away from him. We passed through the massive wrought iron gates of the Lake Norman subdivision. The neighborhood's manicured lawns and pristine driveways usually gave off an aura of quiet wealth and perfect order. The large pine trees and expensive landscaping made it look like a luxury resort. But as we turned the final corner and approached my property, the illusion of perfection completely shattered. The front yard of the lake house looked like a literal war zone. It was so much worse than I had even imagined when I made the phone calls earlier that morning. Dozens of crushed aluminum beer cans and broken liquor bottles were scattered across the bright green grass, glinting in the early morning sun. Two of the expensive custom wooden lawn chairs I had purchased just last month were smashed into jagged pieces near the edge of the driveway. A brightly colored inflatable pool float was deflated and tangled high up in the branches of the expensive weeping willow tree I had planted specifically for my grandmother. The heavy, thick scent of stale alcohol and rotting garbage hung in the crisp morning air, completely ruining the fresh lake breeze that my grandparents loved so much. I parked my car at the very end of the long concrete driveway and turned off the engine. My grandparents stared out the tinted windows in absolute horror at the total destruction of their beautiful retirement home. I told them to stay inside the car for a few minutes where it was safe and air-conditioned so they would not have to step on any broken glass. I grabbed my thick black leather binder off the passenger seat and stepped out onto the driveway. The sharp sound of my heels clicking against the concrete cut through the morning silence. Up on the large wrap-around porch, Terrence and Brittany were furiously scrubbing the wooden deck with buckets of soapy water and heavy bristle brushes. They looked absolutely miserable and completely exhausted. Brittany's perfect blonde hair was frizzy and tied back in a messy knot at the back of her head. She was wearing dirty gray sweatpants and an oversized shirt that was stained with whatever sticky substance the bachelor party guests had spilled all over the expensive outdoor furniture. Terrence was sweating profusely, hauling a massive black garbage bag that looked like it was dripping foul-smelling liquid right onto his expensive designer sneakers. He looked like he had not slept a single minute all night. My mother Valerie was standing near the massive wooden front door holding a plastic dustpan and loudly complaining about the horrible smell of vomit near her favorite flower beds. The sheer irony of the entire situation was almost too delicious to handle. Brittany and Terrence had spoken so arrogantly just yesterday about building passive income and creating massive generational wealth for the family. They thought being short-term property investors meant sitting back by the pool and watching money roll into their bank accounts while doing absolutely nothing. They never considered the brutal reality of renting a luxury home to a dozen drunk men for a wild weekend party. They had demoted themselves from fake real estate moguls to unpaid janitors cleaning up the absolute worst kind of filth just to make a quick few $100s to pay off their massive hidden debts. Terrence dragged the heavy leaking trash bag toward the edge of the porch and dropped it with a loud wet thud against the wood. He wiped his sweating forehead with the back of his dirty hand and looked up toward the street. He finally noticed me walking up the driveway with my black binder tucked securely under my arm. For a brief second, I saw genuine exhaustion and deep panic flash in his dark eyes. But then his lifelong family conditioning kicked in. Terrence was completely incapable of admitting defeat or asking for help with any kind of humility or grace. He immediately straightened his posture, puffed out his chest, and put on that familiar, arrogant smirk that our mother always praised. He walked down the wooden steps of the porch and marched toward me, as if he was the wealthy master of the estate greeting a lazy, disobedient employee. He stopped a few feet away from me and crossed his thick arms over his stained and ruined shirt. He did not say good morning to me. He did not ask how our elderly grandparents slept at the hotel. He just looked at me with absolute toxic contempt and started issuing his ridiculous orders. He told me I was incredibly late and that he expected me here an hour ago to help sanitize the upstairs bathrooms because the guests had destroyed the plumbing. He pointed a dirty, shaking finger toward my car, where my grandparents were patiently waiting in the back seat. He said the bachelor party guests were finally gone, but the next group of high-paying renters was arriving in just a few short hours. He told me I needed to stop wasting his precious time and immediately move Elias and Ruby into the uninsulated boat shed in the backyard before the new guests arrived. He actually stood there covered in garbage juice and sweat and commanded me to hide our elderly grandparents in a wooden shack so he could prepare the main house for his next paying customers. He said they needed to be completely out of sight so they would not ruin the modern aesthetic of the luxury property and risk him getting a bad review on the vacation rental platform. He smiled that smug, golden child smile and told me that if I hurried up and finished scrubbing the kitchen floors, he might let me stay for a small piece of cake later that afternoon. He was so completely absorbed in his own arrogant financial delusion that he did not even notice the sound of heavy tires rolling onto the quiet street behind me. He did not realize that while he was ordering me to scrub his toilets, my meticulously planned legal destruction was already pulling up right behind my car. The heavy black tires of the two police cruisers crunched loudly against the gravel at the very end of the driveway. Terrence stopped talking mid-sentence. His arrogant smirk completely vanished from his face. He looked over my shoulder and his eyes widened in absolute panic. The flashing blue and red lights reflected off the hood of my car, even though the sirens were turned off. Up on the porch, Brittany dropped the heavy bristle brush she was holding and let out a sharp gasp. My mother Valerie froze by the flower beds, clutching her plastic dustpan against her chest like a shield. Terrence immediately went into his typical survival mode. He assumed the neighbors had finally called the authorities to complain about the massive noise from the bachelor party the night before. He desperately tried to wipe the sweat and foul-smelling garbage juice off his face with the back of his dirty sleeve. He forced a fake professional smile onto his face and walked right past me toward the approaching police officers. He started talking incredibly fast, trying to control the narrative. He introduced himself as the property owner and apologized profusely for any disturbance. He told the officers that the bachelor party guests were a bit rowdy last night, but that he had the entire situation completely under control. He even pointed back at me and chuckled nervously, telling the police that I was just his jealous sister who showed up uninvited to cause unnecessary family drama. The two officers did not smile back at him. They did not shake his outstretched hand. They walked up the driveway with their thumbs resting casually on their duty belts, scanning the disastrous yard, the broken lawn chairs, and the deflated pool float. I turned around and walked calmly toward them. I did not raise my voice or act defensive. I reached into the pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out my state-issued identification card. I handed it to the lead officer and introduced myself politely. I told him that I was the one who had called dispatch earlier that morning to request the civil standby. Terrence looked at me like I had grown a second head. His fake smile dropped completely, revealing the sheer confusion underneath. He stepped toward me and hissed under his breath, asking me what the hell I thought I was doing. He turned back to the officers and told them that I was having some kind of mental breakdown and that they needed to escort me off his property immediately. I completely ignored his existence. I unclasped the heavy metal rings of my black leather binder. The sound echoed sharply in the quiet morning air. I pulled out the crisp, printed receipt from the short-term rental platform. I handed the receipt directly to the lead officer. I explained that I had paid $2,500 directly into Brittany's verified bank account late last night. I pointed out the unique confirmation number and the strict terms of service that I had highlighted in bright yellow marker. I told the officers that under our state law, this specific transaction established a legally binding landlord and tenant contract. I explained that my reservation had officially started at the exact moment the payment cleared, and that I was now the sole legal occupant of the premises for the next 48 hours. The lead officer reviewed the paperwork carefully. He checked the dates, the payment confirmation, and the matching name on my identification card. Terrence started to realize what was actually happening. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking pale and genuinely sick. Brittany came running down the wooden porch steps, her dirty gray sweatpants flapping against her legs. She started using her ridiculous therapy speak on the police officers. She cried fake tears and said I was being incredibly toxic and creating a hostile environment for a young black family trying to build generational wealth. She claimed she was the official host and that she had the absolute right to be there to clean the property for my stay. The second officer held up his hand and told Brittany to step back. He looked at Terrence and explained the harsh legal reality of the situation. He said that because they chose to operate a commercial rental business and accepted my money through a formal platform, they were now bound by strict hospitality and tenant laws. He told them that landlords have absolutely no legal right to enter or remain on a rented residential property without giving the current tenant at least 24 hours of prior written notice. The officer handed my documents back to me and nodded his head in confirmation. Terrence completely lost his mind. His voice cracked as he started screaming at the top of his lungs. He yelled that he had the notarized quitclaim deed and that he owned the physical house and the land it sat on. He pointed a shaking, angry finger at my face and demanded that the police arrest me for filing a false police report. He said I was just a bitter, jealous woman trying to steal his hard-earned success. He took an aggressive step toward me, waving his hands wildly in the air. Both officers immediately stepped between us and grabbed Terrence by his arms. They pushed him back hard and warned him that if he did not calm down immediately, he would be leaving the property in heavy metal handcuffs. My mother Valerie ran forward sobbing hysterically. She begged the officers to let Terrence go, saying he was a good boy who was just under a lot of stress from launching his new business venture. She pleaded with me to tell the police it was all a big misunderstanding and that we could resolve this as a family. I looked at her crying face and felt nothing but cold resolve. I turned to the lead officer and stated clearly that I felt physically threatened by these three individuals. I told him they were trespassing on my legally rented property, and I wanted them removed immediately so my grandparents could safely enjoy their retirement celebration. The lead officer turned his back to me and faced my family. His voice was loud and carried absolute authority. He told Terrence, Brittany, and Valerie that the law was entirely on my side. He pointed his finger toward the street and delivered the final devastating blow. He ordered them to leave the premises right that very second. He gave them exactly 10 minutes to gather their personal belongings from the house and get into their vehicles. He promised them, looking directly into Terrence's terrified eyes, that if they were still standing on my driveway when those 10 minutes were up, all three of them would be arrested and booked into the county jail for criminal trespassing. The 10-minute warning from the police officer hung in the heavy morning air. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the lake water against the wooden dock in the distance. Terrence did not move toward the house to pack his belongings. He did not accept his defeat. Instead, he dug his expensive sneakers into the concrete driveway. He puffed out his chest and raised his voice even louder. He told the police officers that they were making a massive mistake. He screamed that he was the legal and rightful owner of the property. He said he had the notarized deed to prove it, and that nobody had the right to kick him off his own land. He glared at me with absolute hatred and flatly refused to leave. Brittany was standing on the bottom step of the porch, clutching her dirty shirt. She looked at Terrence with wide, panicked eyes, hoping he could somehow talk his way out of the situation. My mother Valerie was still crying softly near the flower beds. She kept whispering that this was tearing our family apart. She wanted me to call off the police and just let Terrence have his way like she always did. But Terrence was completely focused on his own massive ego. He demanded that the officers look at his paperwork. He said he had the official quitclaim deed inside the house, and that it absolutely trumped any fake rental agreement I had manufactured. I knew it was finally time to execute the first major drop. I walked slowly toward the front of the police cruiser. The metal hood of the car was warm from the morning sun. I placed my heavy black leather binder directly onto the hood and unsnapped the metal rings. The sharp click made Terrence flinch. I pulled out a thick stack of official county tax records and the original land survey documents. I handed the top page to the lead police officer and asked him to read the name of the registered property owner aloud for everyone to hear. The officer adjusted his heavy duty belt and looked at the paper. He cleared his throat and read the name. He said the property was legally owned by the Shoreline Protection Trust. Terrence let out a loud, harsh laugh. It was a desperate sound full of fake confidence. He pointed a shaking finger at me and told the police that I was an idiot. He said our grandfather Elias was the sole beneficiary of that trust. He claimed that signing the quitclaim deed transferred all of those assets directly to him. Terrence looked so incredibly proud of himself for knowing a few basic legal terms. He thought he had outsmarted me. I did not raise my voice. I looked at Terrence and let a cold, genuine smile cross my face. I told him he was absolutely wrong. I explained that our grandfather Elias never owned a single inch of the dirt we were standing on. I told Terrence that I bought this entire 3-acre parcel of lakefront property 2 years ago, using my own corporate bonuses. I set up the blind trust myself to protect my privacy and to ensure my grandparents would always have a permanent place to live without ever worrying about property taxes. I told him that I was the sole trustee and the sole beneficiary of the Shoreline Protection Trust. The words hit Terrence like a physical blow to the stomach. He staggered back half a step. He looked at the massive, custom-built house and the beautiful, manicured lawn. He looked at the water glistening in the background. He finally realized he was standing on land that belonged entirely to me. He had never owned it. Our grandfather had never owned it. The police officer handed the paper back to me and nodded. He told Terrence that the county land records were absolute and that his 10 minutes were rapidly running out. Brittany let out a high-pitched gasp. She ran her hands through her messy blonde hair and started hyperventilating. She looked at Terrence and asked him what was going on. She demanded to know why he told her they owned a luxury estate. She had already started planning how to spend the passive income for the next 5 years. She had built her entire social media persona around being a wealthy property investor. Now she was standing in dirty sweatpants, realizing her husband was not a real estate mogul at all. He was just a trespasser standing on his younger sister's property. Terrence started shaking his head back and forth in complete denial. He pointed a trembling finger at the black binder on the hood of the police car. He said it was absolutely impossible. He screamed that he had watched our grandfather sign the official quitclaim deed with his own 2 eyes. He said his friend Julian, the notary public, had stamped the document right in front of him. He insisted that the deed had to mean something because the county clerk accepted it and filed it into the public record without any issues. I closed the binder and rested my hands lightly on the black leather cover. I looked deep into my brother's terrified eyes. I watched the last remaining shreds of his arrogance completely dissolve into pure panic. I told him that the county clerk files whatever paperwork is handed to them as long as the formatting is correct and the filing fee is paid. They do not verify the actual assets until a legal dispute is filed. Terrence had relied entirely on a shady friend and a massive ego instead of doing a basic real estate title search. My mother Valerie finally stopped crying and walked slowly toward us. Her face was pale and her hands were shaking uncontrollably. She looked at Terrence, and then she looked at me. The reality of the situation was finally starting to pierce through her lifetime of enabling. She asked me in a quiet, broken voice what Terrence had actually done. If our grandfather did not own the beautiful lakefront property, what exactly did Terrence force him to sign away? Before I could answer my mother's heartbreaking question, Brittany shoved her way past Terrence. She was not ready to give up her fantasy of being a wealthy property investor. She pointed her manicured finger at my chest and started spouting off legal terms she had probably heard on some cheap real estate podcast. She said it did not matter whose name was on the land trust. She claimed that the physical structure of the house was permanently affixed to the ground and therefore belonged to whoever held the deed that our grandfather signed. She actually tried to use her manipulative therapy speak on the police officers again. She told them I was trying to create a toxic legal loophole to steal her husband's rightful inheritance. She said the $200,000 luxury home was a permanent fixture, and the law protected the deed holder of the structure regardless of the dirt underneath it. I just stood there and let her finish her desperate little speech. It is always fascinating to watch someone dig their own grave while genuinely believing they are building a castle. I looked at Brittany and told her she was absolutely right about traditional real estate laws. If this was a traditional stick-built house on a permanent poured concrete foundation, her argument might actually hold up in a messy civil court battle. but I told her she had missed one massive catastrophic detail. I turned to the lead police officer and asked him to look at the second tab in my black leather binder. He flipped the heavy plastic page and pulled out a different set of official state documents. I turned my attention back to my arrogant sister-in-law. I kept my voice perfectly even and explained the reality of the situation. I told her that the beautiful $200,000 lake house she had been so proudly renting out to strangers was not a traditional home. It was a high-end custom modular home. I explained that because of the strict environmental regulations regarding the protected wetlands, I could not pour a traditional deep concrete foundation. The house was assembled off-site and carefully placed onto specialized supportive pilings. Brittany blinked at me, looking completely confused. She asked what difference that made since it still looked and functioned exactly like a normal mansion. I smiled at her sheer ignorance. I explained that in our state, a modular home that is not permanently anchored to a traditional foundation is legally classified as chattel. I spoke the word slowly so they could all hear it clearly. Chattel means personal property. I told them that legally speaking, the massive luxury house behind us was classified the exact same way as a car or a recreational vehicle or a piece of expensive jewelry. It does not transfer with a land deed because it is not legally part of the land. I pointed to the document the police officer was holding. I told Brittany that the physical house had its own separate certificate of title, just like the pink slip of a vehicle, and that title was registered exclusively and permanently in my name. I bought the house with my own money, and I held the sole legal ownership of the structure itself. Terrence did not own the land, and he did not own the walls, the roof, or the floors of the house sitting on top of it. He had absolutely zero legal claim to any part of the lake house. The silence that followed was absolutely deafening. The only sound was the wind rustling through the weeping willow tree near the water. Brittany stared at me with her mouth slightly open, unable to form a single coherent word. Her entire identity as a wealthy, successful host had just been mathematically and legally erased from existence. She looked down at her dirty clothes and the scrubbing brush she had been using. She realized she had spent the entire morning scrubbing vomit and spilled beer off a porch that belonged entirely to the sister-in-law she constantly disrespected. She and Terrence were not brilliant entrepreneurs building generational wealth. They were literally just unauthorized maids cleaning my personal property for free. My mother Valerie let out a loud, dramatic sob and covered her face with her hands. She finally understood the magnitude of the situation. Her golden child had not pulled off a brilliant business move. He had orchestrated a massive, catastrophic failure. The police officers stood there looking at Terrence with absolutely zero sympathy. They told him again that he had exactly 5 minutes left to collect his personal items and vacate my personal property. Terrence was breathing heavily. His chest was heaving up and down under his stained shirt. The reality of his complete failure was finally breaking through his lifelong delusions of grandeur. He looked at the massive custom home he thought he had stolen. Then he looked at the fake quitclaim deed in his shaking hand. His face was completely devoid of color. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting to hit the ground. His voice trembled so badly, he could barely get the words out. He looked at the piece of paper he had forced our grandfather to sign and asked the only question that mattered anymore. If our grandfather did not own the land, and he did not own the house, then what exactly did the deed transfer to him? I watched Terrence standing on the edge of the driveway, his face pale and his breathing shallow. He was begging for an answer. He needed to know what the piece of paper in his hand actually meant. I reached into the third section of my black leather binder. The metal rings clicked open again. This time I pulled out the original public record copy of the quitclaim deed, the exact same document Terrence had filed with the county clerk. I walked slowly toward him and held it up so the morning sun illuminated the black ink. I told Terrence to read the parcel identification number carefully. Terrence squinted at the numbers and letters typed across the top of the page. He shook his head slowly. He said he did not know what those numbers meant. He said Julian had prepared the paperwork and told him it covered the lake house property. I let out a harsh laugh. I asked him if he honestly thought a guy who sold fake sneakers out of his trunk in high school was a reliable source for commercial real estate transfers. I turned to the police officers and my mother Valerie, who was still standing nearby clutching her face. I kept my voice loud and incredibly clear. I explained that our grandfather Elias was a hardworking mechanic his entire life, but he was never wealthy. I told them that Grandpa Elias only ever owned one single piece of commercial real estate. In the late 1970s, he bought an old independent gas station 2 towns over, hoping to start his own auto repair shop. But the economy crashed and he never got the business off the ground. The property had been sitting abandoned and rotting for over 40 years. Terrence stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He asked me what I meant about a gas station. He said the deed was supposed to be for a luxury estate. I pointed directly at the parcel identification number on the document. I told him that number corresponded exactly to the abandoned gas station plot. I explained that when Terrence forced our grandfather to sign that paper, he did not steal a $200,000 lake house. He officially and legally transferred ownership of a rotting 40-year-old commercial property directly into his own name. Brittany let out a desperate, high-pitched laugh. It sounded completely unhinged. She pushed her messy blonde hair out of her face and told Terrence it was not a big deal. She said they could just sell the old gas station land to a commercial developer and use the cash to pay off their debts. She tried to use her fake entrepreneurial voice again, claiming they could easily pivot their investment strategy and flip the commercial plot for a massive profit. I could not help it. I genuinely smiled at her absolute ignorance. I pulled the final set of documents out of the binder. They were thick packets printed on official federal government letterhead. I handed the top packet to the lead police officer and the second packet directly to Terrence. I told Brittany that she was right about one thing. The property was commercial land, but I told her it was completely unmarketable and legally frozen. I watched Terrence read the bold black letters printed at the top of the federal document. The words Environmental Protection Agency were stamped across the page. Terrence looked up at me, his eyes wide with absolute terror. I explained the harsh reality of his new investment. I told him that the old underground chemical storage tanks at the abandoned gas station had been leaking toxic fluids into the surrounding soil and groundwater for decades. I explained that the Environmental Protection Agency had finally inspected the site 3 years ago. They immediately classified the land as a severe biological hazard zone, and because our grandfather was the registered owner at the time, they placed a massive federal lien against the property. The lien mandated a full environmental excavation and chemical cleanup before the land could ever be sold or developed. Grandpa Elias had been terrified of the letters, and I had been quietly working with my corporate attorneys for 2 years, trying to get the fines reduced or forgiven based on his age and financial hardship. Terrence looked back down at the document. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold the paper still. He asked me in a broken whisper how much the lien was for. I did not soften the blow. I did not sugarcoat the reality. I looked him dead in the eye and delivered the third and final drop. I told him the current Environmental Protection Agency, lien, including accumulated interest and daily non-compliance penalties, was exactly $500,000. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The reality of the situation crashed down on Terrence and Brittany like a physical weight. Terrence had not stolen a path to generational wealth. He had not secured a luxury passive income stream. He had deliberately tricked his elderly, visually impaired grandfather into signing a document. And in doing so, Terrence had legally and willingly absorbed a $500,000 federal debt. He was now personally responsible for cleaning up a toxic waste dump. Brittany let out a scream that echoed across the quiet lake water. It was not a fake therapeutic cry, it was a scream of pure, visceral panic. She realized she was legally married to a man who was $500,000 in debt to the federal government. All of her dreams of posting luxury vacation photos and bragging about her real estate empire were completely obliterated. She looked at Terrence with absolute disgust. She yelled at him, asking how he could be so incredibly stupid. She demanded to know how he could execute a hostile takeover of his own family without even reading the damn paperwork. My mother Valerie collapsed onto the grass. She buried her face in her hands and started sobbing loudly. The illusion of her perfect, successful golden child was completely shattered. She was watching her son face total financial annihilation, and there was absolutely nothing she could do to save him. Terrence just stood there staring blankly at the Environmental Protection Agency line. He looked like his entire soul had been ripped out of his body. He realized he had traded everything: his family, his dignity, his freedom for a piece of toxic dirt. Brittany began to hyperventilate. The sound was sharp and erratic, cutting through the heavy silence of the morning. She gripped the wooden railing of the porch so hard her knuckles turned completely white. She looked at Terrence as if he were a complete stranger. Her perfect aesthetic life was burning to the ground right in front of her eyes. She started muttering to herself over and over, saying that this could not be happening and that she was supposed to be a millionaire. She looked down at the keys to her brand new electric vehicle that were still lying on the wooden floorboards where she had thrown them. She realized in real time that the luxury car was not a symbol of her husband's brilliant business acumen but a glaring piece of physical evidence tied directly to a massive federal crime. Terrence finally found his voice, but it was weak and trembling. He looked at me with tears welling in his dark eyes and asked how he was supposed to pay back $500,000 to the government. He said he did not have that kind of money in his accounts. He begged me to help him, saying I could just transfer the trust money to cover the environmental lien and save the family name. I looked at him and felt the final piece of my childhood empathy completely wither away and die. I told him he was focusing on the wrong debt. I told him the Environmental Protection Agency was certainly going to garnish his wages for the rest of his natural life, but they were actually the least of his immediate problems. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. I asked him if he honestly thought I did not know about Apex Capital Solutions. Hearing the name of his shadow lender spoken aloud out in the open made Terrence physically recoil. His eyes darted toward the police officers who were standing completely still, listening to every single word of his public exposure. Terrence tried to shush me, his hands waving frantically in front of his chest. He whispered, begging me to stop talking about the loan in front of the cops, but I was not going to stop. I was going to carve the truth into his chest for everyone to see. I told Terrence that I tracked the public commercial filings. I said I knew he took the fraudulent quitclaim deed for the toxic gas station and drove it straight to a hard money lender 2 counties over. I told the police officers and my mother exactly what he had done. I explained that Terrence used a fake property deed to secure $300,000 in cash at an 18% interest rate. My mother gasped and grabbed the collar of her shirt, looking like she was going to pass out right there on the driveway. I looked back at Terrence and twisted the knife much deeper. I broke down the legal reality of his actions with absolute precision. I told him that the moment he sat at that lender's desk and presented a legally invalid document to secure funding, he committed first-degree mortgage fraud. I explained that when the lender approved the loan and electronically transferred those funds into his personal checking account, he committed federal wire fraud. I told him that I also knew he did not use that money for a technology startup, like he told his wife and our mother. I revealed that I had pulled the offshore routing numbers and saw the hundreds of thousands of dollars he funneled into Cayman Island accounts to pay off his massive underground sports betting debts. Brittany let out another piercing scream. She yelled that she was married to a money launderer. She started crying hysterically, saying she was going to go to federal prison just for being his wife. She fell to her knees on the dirty porch, sobbing into her hands, her expensive clothes soaking up the spilled beer and garbage water. Terrence looked at her and then back at me. He was completely trapped. The illusion of his golden child status was entirely eradicated. He was a fraud, a thief, and a massive failure. My mother Valerie tried to intervene one last time. She stumbled forward, her face stained with tears and her voice cracking. She told me that Terrence made a mistake, but he could just declare bankruptcy and start over. She said the banks would just take the car and the property, and we could all move on from this nightmare as a family. She was still trying to protect him with her willful ignorance. She still thought this was a normal financial mistake that could be erased with some paperwork and a good corporate lawyer. I looked at Valerie with absolute pity. I told her she did not understand who Terrence had borrowed the money from. I turned my gaze back to my terrified brother. He was shaking so violently, his knees looked like they were going to buckle under his own weight. I delivered the final devastating truth of this particular trap. I told Terrence that Apex Capital Solutions is not a traditional bank. They are not regulated by the Federal Reserve. They do not send polite letters in the mail when you default on a loan, and they absolutely do not care about personal bankruptcy filings. I leaned in, slightly lowering my voice so only he and my mother could hear the absolute finality in my tone. I told him that the loan was structured with an acceleration clause triggered by municipal violations. Because the county inspectors were on their way right now to cite him for the illegal rental, the entire $300,000 was about to become due immediately. I looked deep into his panicked, terrified eyes. The men who lent you that money aren't a bank, Terrence. They're going to break your legs before the FBI even gets to you. Terrence staggered backward until his shoulders hit the wooden railing of the porch. He looked like all the oxygen had been vacuumed out of the air. He tried to speak, but only a pathetic raspy sound came out of his throat. He was finally visualizing the violent men who held his massive debt. He knew I was right. The federal government would eventually take his freedom, but the loan sharks would come for his life long before that happened. The sheer weight of his impending destruction settled over the driveway like a thick, suffocating fog. Even the two police officers stood completely silent, processing the massive scale of the financial fraud they had just witnessed. But the universe was not finished punishing my brother. Right on cue, the heavy crunch of gravel echoed from the street. Two new vehicles turned sharply into the long driveway parking right behind the police cruisers. The first was a spotless silver sedan, and the second was a white county utility truck with bright yellow municipal logos stamped on the side doors. I looked down at my watch. It was exactly the time I had arranged for the final phase of the legal strike to arrive. Richard, the president of the Homeowners Association, stepped out of the silver sedan. He was a tall, imposing man who ran our wealthy neighborhood like a strict military compound. He was wearing perfectly pressed khaki trousers and a deep scowl on his face. He held a heavy metal clipboard packed with carbon copy citation forms. Right behind him, the county water resource inspector stepped out of the white utility truck. He was wearing a high-visibility safety vest and carrying a digital measuring device, along with a stack of federal violation notices. Richard marched straight up the driveway, completely ignoring my mother, who was still sobbing on the wet grass. He stopped right in front of the porch stairs and looked Terrence up and down with absolute disgust. He asked Terrence in a booming, authoritative voice if he was the registered host of the commercial property listing he had found online. Terrence was so terrified and confused that he just numbly nodded his head. He was so used to proudly claiming ownership of his fake empire that he admitted to the zoning crime without even thinking about the consequences. Richard did not hesitate. He started ripping yellow citation tickets off his clipboard and slapping them directly against Terrence's chest. He listed the neighborhood violations in a loud, punishing tone. He cited Terrence for operating an unauthorized commercial business within a strict residential zone. He issued maximum penalties for severe noise ordinance violations from the bachelor party the night before. He added fines for the destruction of approved landscaping and for allowing 6 unauthorized vehicles to park on the grass overnight. He told Terrence that the Homeowners Association Board had already held an emergency morning vote and they were levying immediate fines totaling $5,000. Before Terrence could even process the yellow papers fluttering to the ground around his expensive ruined sneakers, the county water resource inspector stepped forward. The inspector looked out toward the sparkling lake water and pointed at the damaged lawn where the septic system was buried underground. He did not yell, but his calm, bureaucratic voice carried the heavy, crushing weight of federal authority. He explained that the entire property sat on a highly protected environmental wetland boundary. The inspector looked directly at Terrence and explained that the custom septic system was strictly rated and legally permitted for a maximum of 2 elderly residents. By hosting a massive bachelor party with over a dozen adult men, Terrence had overloaded a fragile waste system directly adjacent to the municipal drinking water supply. The inspector handed Terrence a thick red envelope. He stated clearly that Terrence was being cited under the Federal Clean Water Act for gross negligence and unauthorized commercial environmental hazards. The fine was an immediate $10,000 due within 30 days. The inspector warned Terrence that if the $15,000 in combined fines were not paid immediately, the county would bypass the property and place a direct federal lien on Terrence's personal bank accounts and mandate heavy wage garnishments. Terrence stood there holding the red envelope, his hands shaking so violently he dropped it onto the wet wooden porch. In less than 20 minutes he had been exposed as a fraud, a thief, a federal felon, and now he was personally liable for hundreds of thousands of dollars in debts and immediate fines. I turned my attention to Brittany. She had been standing perfectly still, watching the citations pile up around her husband's feet. The realization of her new reality was fully setting in. She had married Terrence because she thought he was a rising star in the corporate world. She stayed with him because he promised her a life of luxury, passive income, and social media fame. Now she was staring at a man who was facing decades in federal prison, owing $500,000 to the Environmental Protection Agency, $300,000 to violent loan sharks, and $15,000 in immediate municipal fines. Something inside Brittany completely snapped. The carefully curated therapy speak she used to manipulate everyone around her instantly vanished. She let out a guttural scream of pure, unfiltered rage. She marched up the steps and shoved Terrence hard in the chest. She screamed that he was a pathetic, broke loser who had ruined her entire life. She yelled that she refused to be dragged down into poverty and federal prison because he was too stupid to read a basic property deed. Terrence tried to reach out and grab her arms, begging her to calm down and saying they could figure it out together. Brittany slapped his hands away with absolute venom in her eyes. She reached down to her left hand and grabbed her heavy diamond wedding ring. She ripped it off her finger with so much force it left a bright red mark on her skin. She threw the ring directly at Terrence's face. The diamond bounced off his cheek and clattered down into the dirty cracks of the wooden porch. She pointed her finger right between his eyes and screamed at the top of her lungs. She told him their marriage was completely over. She announced right there in front of the police officers, the county inspectors, and my crying mother that she was calling a divorce lawyer the second she got her phone. She turned around and grabbed the keys to the brand new electric vehicle from the porch floor. She looked at Terrence with absolute disgust and told him she was taking the Tesla and driving back to her parents' house. She had absolutely no idea that the luxury car was bought with fraudulent wire transfers and would be seized by federal agents within the week. She just wanted to escape the burning wreckage of the life they had tried to steal from my grandparents. As Brittany scrambled toward her car, leaving the heavy diamond ring sitting in the dirt, my mother Valerie finally broke completely. She let out a loud, agonizing wail that sounded like a wounded animal. She dropped heavily to her knees right there on the wet concrete of the driveway. The knees of her expensive designer slacks soaked up the muddy water and spilled beer, but she did not care. She crawled forward on her hands and knees until she reached where I was standing. She threw her arms around my legs, burying her tear-stained face into the fabric of my tailored navy blue suit. She started begging me in a high-pitched, hysterical voice. She sobbed that I had to do something to stop all of this. She pleaded with me to call my expensive corporate lawyers and pay off the citations. She said I had millions of dollars in my trust fund and that I could easily afford to make the environmental lien disappear. She cried that Terrence was my only brother and that the loan sharks were going to kill him if I did not step in and save his life right this very second. I stood completely still, looking down at the top of her head. I did not reach down to comfort her. I did not place my hand on her shaking shoulder. I just let her cry. For 32 years, this woman had demanded that I make myself smaller so her golden child could shine. When I got straight A's in school, she told me not to brag because Terrence was struggling with his grades. When I bought my first investment property, she called me selfish for not letting Terrence live there rent-free. She had spent my entire life teaching me that my only purpose was to be a safety net for his reckless behavior. But the most unforgivable part was not what she did to me. It was what she had allowed him to do to her own parents. She knew Terrence had forced my grandfather out of his home. She knew he had planned to shove two elderly people into a damp, uninsulated boat shed just so he could rent their house to a bunch of drunk strangers. And she had defended him. She had prepared expensive appetizers and smiled while her own father shook with fear. I looked down at Valerie and spoke with a voice that was completely empty of any daughterly affection. It was the voice of a wealth manager terminating a toxic asset. I told her to let go of my legs. She shook her head and gripped my suit even tighter, sobbing that we were a family and that families protect each other. I stepped back, forcing her arms to drop to the ground. I looked directly into her red, puffy eyes. I told her that she was right about one thing. Families are supposed to protect each other. But she had abandoned that principle a long time ago. I spoke the words slowly, so they would echo in her mind for the rest of her life. I told her that she chose her son over her own parents' safety and well-being. I told her that they both deserved exactly what was coming to them. Valerie gasped as if I had physically struck her across the face. She slumped forward onto the concrete, weeping uncontrollably. Terrence was still standing frozen near the porch, staring blankly into space, as the water resource inspector finished filling out the massive federal citation. I turned my head and gave a brief nod to the lead police officer. The officer understood exactly what I meant. He stepped forward and grabbed Terrence by the arm. The second officer gently but firmly pulled my mother up from the wet ground. They escorted my brother and my mother down the long driveway toward their parked cars. Richard, the Homeowners Association president, handed Terrence the stack of yellow neighborhood fines and told him to never set foot in the community again. I stood on the driveway and watched as Terrence climbed into the passenger seat of our mother's car. He looked like a completely broken shell of a man. Valerie started the engine, her hands shaking so badly she could barely put the car into drive. They slowly rolled down the street and turned the corner, disappearing from my sight. Brittany had already driven off, leaving nothing but a cloud of dust behind her. The heavy rumbling sounds of the police cruisers and the county utility truck eventually faded away into the distance. A deep, beautiful silence finally fell over the lake. The air felt incredibly clean. The foul stench of the bachelor party seemed to vanish, blown away by the gentle morning breeze coming off the water. I turned around and walked over to my car, where my grandparents were still waiting safely inside. I opened the door and offered my hand to my grandfather, Elias. He looked at me with wide, uncertain eyes. He asked me if the bad people were gone. I smiled a genuine warm smile for the first time that entire weekend. I told him they were gone forever, and that nobody would ever bother them again. I helped him and Grandma Ruby out of the vehicle and guided them slowly up the wooden steps of the porch. I sat them down in the large, comfortable rocking chairs facing the beautiful blue water. I walked into the kitchen, stepping over the trash bags Terrence had left behind. I opened the high wooden cabinet and pulled out a bottle of my grandfather's absolute favorite vintage bourbon. I poured a generous splash into a heavy crystal glass and carried it out to the porch. I handed it to him and watched his hands steady as he took a sip. Then I went back inside to the living room. I found the black plastic trash bag where Brittany had thoughtlessly thrown his vintage jazz records. I carefully pulled out his favorite vinyl album, dusted off the cover, and placed it onto the record player. The smooth, soulful sounds of the saxophone floated out through the open windows, filling the quiet morning air with absolute peace. 3 months have passed since that incredible morning at the lake house. The fallout from Terrence's massive greed was more spectacular than I ever could have engineered myself. The Federal Bureau of Investigation officially raided his rented apartment just 4 weeks later. They seized all of his electronics and froze every single bank account tied to his name. He was officially indicted on multiple counts of first-degree mortgage fraud and federal wire fraud. But the federal agents were actually the safest option for him. The loan sharks had started sending violent debt collectors to his door, forcing Terrence to flee the state entirely. He is currently hiding in a cheap motel somewhere out west, terrified to even show his face outside. Brittany filed for emergency divorce the very next day, just like she promised. But escaping the marriage did not save her from the financial ruin. Because her luxury electric vehicle was purchased with fraudulent funds, federal agents arrived at her parents' house and repossessed the car right in the middle of a Sunday afternoon neighborhood barbecue. Her entire fake social media empire collapsed overnight, and she was forced to take a minimum wage job as a receptionist just to pay her massive legal fees. As for my mother Valerie, she lost everything trying to pay for Terrence's criminal defense lawyers. She had to sell her beautiful colonial home and move into a tiny one-bedroom apartment on the bad side of town. The wealthy friends she spent her entire life trying to impress completely abandoned her the moment the scandal hit the local news. She sits alone in her cramped apartment, completely alienated from the community and the family she destroyed. Meanwhile, my grandparents are thriving. They spend their days fishing off the wooden dock and their evenings listening to jazz music on the porch of the home I built for them. They are safe and they are loved. My family spent 32 years treating me like an afterthought. They thought because I was quiet and compliant as a child that I would just surrender my assets to them as an adult. They thought my success meant I owed them my life. They forgot that I evaluate risks for a living, and they were the worst investment of all. If you have ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your own peace and your own future, I want to hear your story. Let me know how you found your strength in the comments below. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about surviving family betrayal and building your own empire. Share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that walking away from toxic people is not a weakness, it is the ultimate power move. Remember, you do not owe anyone your sanity or your success simply because you share the same bloodline. You have the right to protect your peace at all costs. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you in the next one.